Thanks for your patience. Welcome to Lazard's inaugural event at COP. We're really excited to be here. The topic of this discussion is Decarbonization Decoded. This is obviously very topical with the global stock take, but we're fortunate here to have really diverse perspectives on stage. A financial institution CEO, a Harvard Kennedy School professor, and hopefully a retired four-star admiral. And we believe, despite and Nikita, my fellow moderator. Nikita is the global co-head of sustainable investing and ESG at Lazard. I'm Zach Halem. I'm the director of Lazard's Climate Center. And we hope with this diverse perspectives talking about decarbonization, we can decode it in a unique way. I'll turn it over to Nikita, who could do introductions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're very excited to be here as our first event at COP28 with Lazard's Climate Center and Lazard Asset Management. As Zach said, our goal here is to really try to unpack the climate change opportunity and the risks that it presents, particularly to financial markets. So we'll start with a little bit of a discussion around the global carbon stocktake, talk about the macroeconomic environment and its impact on the energy transition as we think about how it shifts the pace and the depth of the transition, and then talk about the private sector response, both in terms of the required responsibility, but perhaps more interestingly, just the sheer economic disruptive force that climate change is likely to present, and the other side of it being a tremendous investment opportunity for those, especially in the financial markets. So with that, Zach will start off our discussion on the global stocktake.
Thanks. So I'll turn to you, Joe, first, given your long history both at COP, part of formal negotiating teams. According to the latest UN environmental program, the world is on track to increase up to 2.9 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Is this an ambition gap, an implementation gap? What do we think we're going to learn in the global stocktake?
Thanks, Zach. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think we've already had a lot of work done leading up to this COP to assess progress. What we have seen is certainly goals that are not ambitious enough when we think about the goals elaborated in the Paris Agreement to limit warming well below 2 degrees C and aspire to keep warming to 1.5 degrees C. We also know that the goals that have been set, we're not doing enough to implement them. I think we've seen tremendous progress in the United States passing the Inflation Reduction Act. We're starting to see some, I think, pretty impressive responses to that in terms of the initial investment decisions, building off of those incentives. But even saying that, the current modeling analysis for the United States suggests that even with the Inflation Reduction Act, we'll fall short of the goal of having emissions by 2030. I think the key thing, though, to recognize is that we knew we were going to fall short way back in 2015. It's actually in the Paris Agreement where we acknowledged that the pledges that countries had brought to Paris were not enough to be on track consistent with this temperature goal. We have seen, I think, improvement in terms of how we've enhanced our programs and our policies since then. So almost every country has done now at least a second version of its nationally determined contribution. So we're making progress. It's not enough when we think about our goals, but we're in a much better place than we were 8 or 10 years ago, where we thought 3.5, 4 degrees C was actually probably more likely given the current state of goals and given the current state of the implementation of those goals. So there is an implementation gap. There is an ambition gap. I think we're starting to close some of those. But it's also important to recognize that we're really working against time right now because of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the past several decades. What's left in terms of the carbon budget to keep those goals in line requires really dramatic action if you're going to do this through the cutting of emissions.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think the main question is moving from international policy to domestic policy. How are nations responding in that, apart from carbon pricing or carbon taxing or a cap and trade mechanism, what else can governments do to try to lower the ambition gap and lower the implementation gap, both in terms of the carbon transition, but also the energy transition? Peter, maybe you?
Sure, and I think this is very important because while everyone can yearn for sufficient carbon pricing, the fact of the matter is, in many cases, that's not going to be a reality during this critical window of time. So the question becomes, what else can governments do? An obvious example is the Inflation Reduction Act that Joe already mentioned, but let me highlight two other things that may have received less attention. One is to change the way that governments evaluate the interventions that they can undertake. So I would highlight what should be better known, which is the changes in the A4 regulations in the US that dictate the discount rate that is used to evaluate the costs and benefits of government regulation. The Biden administration recently moved the discount rate that's used in those studies to 2% real, which is significantly lower than rates in the past, either 3 or 7, depending on the context. And it's surprising how much difference that can make. So if you look at the social cost of carbon, for example, that has moving from the set of regulations that were in place with a 3% discount rate. The social cost of carbon was in the mid-50s. At an updated social cost of carbon, including the 2% discount rate, is more in the 190s. Now, that's not all entirely due to the change in the discount rate, but it's a lot of that is due to the change in the discount rate. So, a 1/3 reduction, just because of the way the math works, in the discount rate leads to, not quite a tripling of the social cost of carbon, but a massive increase. And that then gets applied to lots of different things that the government's going to be evaluating. So that's one big thing. Second big thing is the opportunity for what I've called a mega Brussels effect to drive energy efficiency in key sectors. So the most salient example of this is what I hope will soon be consummated in the form of a green steel and aluminum club between the EU and the US. Because the fact of the matter is, if the US and the EU came together on effectively what energy efficiency standards would work in very energy intensive sectors like steel and aluminum, it will change behavior not only in Europe and the US, but across the world, because those markets are so big combined that you really could not ignore it. So there's a well-known Brussels effect where the impact of EU regulation goes global because the EU by itself is an important enough entity. The mega Brussels effect is when you have the US and the EU acting together, and we have a very timely example in the form of a green aluminum and steel club that's possible. So there are 3 examples, including the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thanks, Peter. Coming to a little bit about a discussion on how policy and the macroeconomic environment starts to impact the pace and depth of the energy transition, as we said in the introduction. And what we're most curious about as asset managers at Lazard is yes, recognizing that climate change is a existential issue and is going to have significant impacts on our society and economy. As investors, it's part of our fiduciary responsibility to think about how and where that starts to get priced into financial markets. And what we found is there tend to be 3 major levers. Changes in technology as the levelized costs of energy shift, and we have a really thorough study we've been doing for years on the financial advisory side of our business. The second being major shifts in policy and regulation, and the third being shifts in consumer behavior. And consumers, not just end consumers like you and me, but really along the value chain of business and society. So thinking about those 3 major catalysts and how they find their way into being priced in the markets, perhaps we can start with you, Peter. What do you find as the state of the market signals currently for the energy transition?
Well, thank you. The way I would put it is they're there, but they're pretty weak. So the Lazard Climate Center actually has documented that there is a relationship between emissions and price to equity ratios, or the valuation of companies. So there is an effect that public markets are demonstrating. It's pretty small. It's statistically significant, but it's pretty small on average. So a 10% increase, all else equal, in emissions is associated with about a 0.5% change in the price to equity, price earnings ratio, which, you know, is there but not massive. Now that varies a lot across sectors and countries, and it can be a lot larger in large industrial companies in Europe, for example, but on average it's pretty small. So I'd say it's there, but not yet sufficient to be driving the kind of change that Joe had earlier said. In addition to that, I'd say there are two other things about markets to highlight. One is the recent reversal, if you will, or the recent repricing of many companies that are particularly focused on the energy transition. And over the past 6 months or so, there's been fairly significant kind of backtracking, at least in terms of current valuation. I think that's probably a temporary phenomenon, as it's unavoidable that these companies will be playing a much larger role going forward. So that's one kind of market maybe disconnect. And the second one is if you look at any of the pathways to get to net zero over time, and the implied, let's just focus on oil, for example, the implied oil production that is embodied in that net zero pathway, and then you compare that to either projections from market analysts or from the oil companies themselves, or to the implicit projections within current valuation in the sector, there's a massive disconnect between what markets and the private sector are projecting for, in this case, oil demand, and the implications of the net zero pathway that Joe had talked about earlier. So there's another disconnect. So again, markets are starting to price some of this, but there clearly are divergences between market prices today and what needs to happen to get anywhere close to net zero.
Thank you, Peter. But it's hard to perhaps, you know, separate this out as an individual issue that we can do portfolio attribution on. But I do think idiosyncratically we're seeing tremendous opportunities in climate change. A lot of it being driven by policy, right? Especially with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, arguably one of the largest climate change-related policies in the world. It's already resulted in over $400 billion of investments across the value chain and over 300,000 jobs across the United States and beyond. And it's starting to shift supply chains. And despite a lot of short-term pressure on energy prices and a continued expectation that traditional energy forms will continue to be the most important source of energy for the world for perhaps several decades, new forms of energy are gaining tremendous potential because of policy support. I was wondering, Joe, if you could share your views. One of the hypotheses at us on the asset management side is the forecasted policy scenario is perhaps quite much lower than what an average analyst should be assuming. And if you have a out-of-market consensus view on the policy shifts, especially as the physical risks of climate change we start to experience more, then that policy will increasingly kick in around the world, be more harmonious, and then we'll get the pricing signal that we're not seeing yet in the market. So we'd love to hear your views on that.
So I think it's important to recognize how I think policy and some uncertainty about how policy will evolve will influence some of these decisions around investments. And that uncertainty goes in two directions. There are some uncertainties right now that are, I think, pausing some of the investments in the United States. We're not going quite as fast as we think we can. We're not going quite as fast as we need to. In part because it's not just are we able to provide sufficient subsidies to make economic some of these investments, do we have the kind of coordination in our policy that is necessary to complement that kind of infrastructure investment? So it's having the kind of planning and siting and approval processes that can move as fast as right now the private sector is ready to move in building out a lot of clean energy infrastructure. So there's some uncertainty, and this is something that is being dealt with, certainly at the federal government, but some of it they have to partner with state and local governments to be able to make that happen quickly. I think there's also other factors that are sort of outside of the policy sphere, but influence how effective policy can be in the short term. The recent rise in interest rates has actually created a little bit of anxiety in some of the more capital-intensive and a little bit more novel projects that are kind of on the margin of whether or not they're economic, even with some of these subsidies. So this is a concern, for example, with offshore wind, about whether or not they're going to really be able to move forward, given how the costs to implement those projects now are fundamentally different than they were just 12 months, 18 months ago. So I think those are some of the sort of the downside uncertainties. I think the upside uncertainty, though, is as we start moving forward. I mean, when we think about like what comes after this global stock take, we know we're not doing enough. The big question that will be addressed here and next year and the year after in the COPs is what do we do after we have this sort of consensus we're not doing enough to deal with climate change. And to the extent that we start to see countries learning from the global stock take, learning from transparency on each other's actions, gain better trust and confidence, that not only do we feel like in our country we may be doing more, but our peers, our neighbors, our trade partners are as well. It makes it easier for everyone else to take that next more aggressive step. Will we get to, I think, a more of a coordinated approach that makes it easier for the private sector to see where those investment opportunities are and where the policy frameworks implementing those more ambitious goals will actually help create stronger market signals for that kind of investment. So I think that's kind of the upside uncertainty that could help actually drive greater investment going forward.
And I think we've hinted on macroeconomic trends on how interest rates are affecting both climate policy and also investments in the area. But how about geopolitics, which is another theme of this discussion? I'm not sure we'll be able to get Bill, but we'll try it out. The Russia-Ukraine war, I think, opened a lot of eyes about energy reliability and energy security. If you are there, Bill, how would you say that geopolitics, both in Europe, also in the Middle East or U.S.-China, how's it affecting the energy transition?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Zach, I think it's going to be too disruptive for me to talk through this unless you can hear me now. All right, Zach. Hey, Zach, I'm gonna sign off, and I'm afraid this is just too disruptive.
The problem is that we can hear ourselves from the speaker. So either you have to have AirPods or headsets, earphones.
Okay, so a couple of comments about how the geopolitics and when we think about the conflicts and the impact they've had on energy markets. I mean, for one thing, they've crowded out some of the fiscal space that might have been available to dedicate towards climate change. We've seen extensive, over the past 18 months, extensive expenditures in European countries to try to manage the shock to natural gas and electricity prices resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The question then is, does this serve as a kind of impetus and motivation for more rapidly trying to decarbonize and getting out of the gas business as a consumer? There's been some people saying this could be a really advanced investment, say, in electric heat pumps to get out of the role of gas and heating in Europe. But I think it has put pressure on a number of governments when we think about both the fiscal space, but also the politics about how aggressively you can move in a high energy price environment. We certainly see that in terms of the politics in the United States. When energy prices are high, it's kind of hard to move aggressive climate change policy. And so I think that is when I think about how the geopolitics influences policy, that's certainly going to be one important consideration. I don't think many other countries in the world can try to replicate an IRA like we have in the United States. I don't think the United States right now could necessarily replicate an IRA. We will likely have, I think, a meaningful debate. We will have a meaningful debate on tax policy in the U.S. in 2025. We have a number of significant tax policy provisions expiring then. And the question, though, is what do we do in that? That may have implications for the climate. But some of that's going to depend on sort of where we are in terms of what are our expenditures associated with defense as a result of changes in tensions around the world. What do we think is going to be the cost of borrowing for the federal government then? Some of that, I think, will influence how aggressive one can think about policy moving forward, given how the world has changed some over the past couple of years.
It is a pity you're not getting to hear from Admiral McRaven today, but one of the things I wanted to ask him about, and I think is a big part of the energy transition story, are critical materials that input into the energy transition as parts of the technology and value chain. So when we think about whether it's materials like lithium, nickel, copper, silicon carbide, graphite, individual pieces of equipment that go into large wind turbines and solar panels. These are really essential components of the energy transition, and through geopolitics, there can be pressure on accessing such critical materials. Our geopolitical advisory team at Lazard has put together a fantastic report on critical materials that I urge you to read if you're interested in the topic. And on the asset management side, again, with every risk, there is also an incredible opportunity. So we have a clean energy materials strategy that is aimed at exactly that, trying to understand how shifting geopolitics create opportunities for different materials that feed into the energy transition. So geopolitics will, and as it is already, continue to be a really important part of that risk opportunity assessment.
So diluting down these trends we've analyzed in macroeconomics, geopolitics, down to the firm level in terms of private sector implications, I'll turn to you first, Joe, to talk about the global stock take and its impact on companies and investors. You co-authored a report with somebody I may know. It's the Lazard Climate Center a couple of months ago called Behind Schedule, which looks at corporate commitments and the degree to which companies were on track to meet decarbonization goals, or more so I should say not on track. How do you see the interface between firm commitments and governments meeting NDCs? And as a result of that, what's the GST going to mean for companies?
So one thing that was novel in the Paris Agreement is that it explicitly acknowledged the important role that non-state actors can play, including the private sector. And we saw, certainly in the years since Paris, a push not just for countries to adopt voluntary emission mitigation pledges through their nationally determined contributions and to enhance those over time. We saw more and more pressure from various stakeholders, whether it's the investment community, whether it's civil society, in some cases the employees of the firms, to push management of major corporations to adopt voluntary emission goals for those companies. And so what we've seen of large cap companies, the Russell 3000, the 3,000 largest publicly traded companies in the United States, more than 20% of them now have adopted voluntary goals to cut their emissions. What we've seen when trying to assess their progress in delivering on those goals, we tried to estimate what is the rate of decarbonization of the corporate footprint necessary to stay on track for meeting that goal. Some of these goals are for 2025, some for 2030, some are set way out until 2050. But we thought, how do you make sort of steady progress, estimate that, and then see if what they're doing in practice is either ahead of that, even more rapid decarbonization than what their goal calls for, or less than it. Unfortunately, but perhaps not that surprisingly, when we think about this in the context of the country level experience, we see that a majority of companies are behind schedule, that they are decarbonizing at slower annual rates than what is necessary to be on track for meeting their voluntary emission goals. Now, having said that, I think it's important to recognize there is incredible dispersion or heterogeneity across these firms. So we looked across major categories of industries, about a dozen of them. And every single industry on average, we're falling behind. Now, some not too bad. The utility sector is about 1% less aggressive than what their decarbonization rate should be on average for meeting their goals. And every one of those sectors, though, whether it's utilities or materials, energy sector, communication services, what have you, there are companies that are beating their goals, that they are better than on track for their goals. So I think one thing that's important here that I think actually parallels what we see in the international sphere here under the Paris Agreement for countries is that there's an opportunity for learning. That if we can be a bit more systematic in our transparency about what companies are doing, we can learn from those who are leading, who are actually doing a good job cutting their emissions, draw some lessons that could be applied to other companies, just as we have under the Paris Agreement, under the transparency mechanism, an opportunity to learn what individual countries are doing and implementing their NDCs. One of the things I want to stress is I think at the end of the day, if we are going to be successful decarbonizing economies, it's because we have aggressive actions by both companies and countries. Countries can't go too far ahead of companies. Companies at the end of the day are the ones who are going to be making investment decisions, changing processes. They're the ones who at the end of the day, they're changing how we use and produce energy that affects the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere. But I think there's value actually in having companies trying to push countries and showing how far they can go and where there are opportunities to make these kinds of investments to decarbonize and show where public policy can go forward and try to accelerate this process.
At the company level, talking about energy transition plans or decarbonization plans, I'll turn to you, Peter, because you are the CEO of a company. How do you see climate playing out in your decision making, and what's Lazard doing in response to both a growing TAM in the space, but also hesitation around companies meeting their goals?
Well, thank you. I'd say, look, as you all probably know, Lazard has two businesses, asset management and advisory. In asset management, I think the energy transition and climate risk is embedded into the investment decision-making process as a risk factor. So it's not for benevolence or anything other than the fact that we do think that it will affect financial returns, and that needs to be incorporated into the analysis of investments to make. On the advisory side, there's a lot of activity. So we already highlighted some of the findings with regard to companies' emissions affecting their valuation, disclosure of those voluntary disclosure offsetting part of the stock market penalty to emissions. So there's a lot of advice or questions that we get from clients about, should I be disclosing if I don't have to? So all the activity around the Climate Center. We have a very active advisory business on energy transition. We have some of our bankers here with us today. So across the firm, I'd say there's a lot of activity, which is why we're at the COP.
Great. And I think we'll wrap up the formal questions before we open up to the audience. I'm just curious to flip the script a little bit. What questions do you hope, Joe and Peter, will be answered at COP as it's relative to your line of work?
So when I think about how the COP has evolved, the first COP I attended was in 1998. It was a much smaller event in Buenos Aires. It fit within one small conference center, not spread across, well, we're in building 84, at least 84 buildings here. And I think, back then we were really trying to figure out what is a multilateral climate architecture that we think is actually durable and up to the challenge. And I think right now, we're trying to see if this new vision that the world agreed to in Paris in 2015 is capable of delivering on what we need climate policy to do. So part of it, when I think about the answers, to be honest, it's not going to be answered in the next 2 weeks. But I think the fact that we're doing the first global stock take, and that we're going to then be starting this process to think about that next round of NDCs, it's really going to be the test of whether this kind of act, learn, and then act again model that is the Paris Agreement, whether that framework can actually yield a kind of positive dynamic where we really ratchet and become more ambitious with our policies, and that we see then the private sector likewise ratchet their investment strategies in line with where they see not just the goals, but really matters where the policies are going, and being able to show what is actually possible when we think about decarbonizing the energy economy and more broadly than that. So I think it's really seeing how much progress we can make in illustrating the vision that is the Paris Agreement on this kind of act, learn, act approach to policy.
And I think the global stock take will be a first indicator, at least, of that in a material way. How about you, Peter? What question are you hoping to have answered by the end of COP?
Well, I'm trying to evaluate what question would I like to have answered and what question can I plausibly expect to have answered, and those two things are different. But look, I think here's the way I would phrase it. On the technology side, things have probably turned out better than you could have expected 10 or 15 years ago. So if you were sitting in this room in 2009 and projected that the cost of photovoltaic solar would decline by 83% between 2009 and today, or that the cost of onshore wind would decline by 63%, according to the Lazard Levelized Cost of Energy Studies, between 2009 and today, I think most people in the room would have thought that that was too optimistic, but that's what's happened. The problem is what we talked about before, which is the market signals to get full deployment of even the existing technology, let alone encourage ongoing progression further, is still not there. So it comes back to this gap that Joe talked about where one needs to be from a scientific perspective or save the world perspective and the path that we're currently on. And that is the big looming question. I don't expect that to be answered here. But what I would also say is, coming back to the ways that governments can act, even if it's not carbon pricing, there are lots of smaller steps that can add up to something bigger. And so I suppose the best hope that we have for this COP is a series of further incremental steps that will at least move in the right direction, even if they won't fully address that gap.
Great. With that, we'll open it up to the audience if there's any questions.
Thanks for the presentation. My name is Mike Jung. I lead a climate think tank at ICF, large consultancy around the world. My question to the panel is, from the question was raised, is there an upside underestimation? And we know that the Inflation Reduction Act had, I think it was a CBO score of some 370 billion. Can't trust those CBO scores, but that was the best guess at the time. I think we've seen that it's probably a little bit of a lowball estimate, considering the trillions that are being mobilized now. Does that translate into individual investment decisions? We talked about governments, we talked about companies, but there are also individual household level investment decisions that are being made and being affected by policies like the IRA. Do those kinds of actions translate into progress that might also be underestimated in terms of our decarbonization footprint? And how does that fit into the big picture?
So let me make the following comment. I'm going to have a bit of an analogy here, which is the Congressional Budget Office, which I used to run in a former life, is very good at micro estimates. It's very bad, like any entity would be, at systemic change analysis and kind of feedback loops. And so there are lots of examples, and the one that I would highlight is the debate over the healthcare cost trajectory, which CBO, in 2009 and 10 said that would not be altered. If you look at the data, right at 2010, it's still growing too rapidly, but there was a very marked shift in the cost per beneficiary that occurred right at that time that CBO missed. And the reason that CBO missed it is it was a combination of many different things interacting with one another that led to the macro impact. So I similarly do think, I mean, the IRA includes a lot of different things that are just being thrown against the wall on purpose. I actually think that's the right approach. There's not one single thing that's going to work here. And I suspect, without knowing for sure, and maybe Joe can comment on this, that the total impact will be material from some things working much better than expected, others not, and the interaction effects that come from trying lots of different things and signaling that this is the direction that we're moving in, even if we haven't fully done all of the changes that are necessary.
So a couple quick points. One, as Peter already noted, we've seen this incredible reduction in the cost of solar. CBO, or is actually Joint Committee on Taxation. When we changed the subsidy for solar, the investment tax credit in 2008, and then when we made it eligible for a grant in lieu of a tax credit in the Recovery Act of 2009, combined estimated that over 2009 to 2016, or basically over the 10-year window, it'd be about $2 billion of tax expenditures and grant outlays. It wound up being about $30 billion. So they were off by a factor of 15. Now, the good thing is because solar got so cheap, we saw so much more adoption of solar. And I think it's one thing, especially for those of you who are not familiar with how we subsidize things through the tax code in the United States, for the vast majority of the tax credits that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not capped. And so if you get a winning technology, you might see big upside in terms of the claims on those tax credits, which corresponds to big upside in reducing emissions. But there's a question about, are we going to spend about $400 billion, which was kind of the ballpark headline number coming with the bill when it was passed in 2022. There are other estimates suggesting it might be $800 billion, it might be $1 trillion, it might be $1.2 trillion. And to be honest, a lot of it is going to be uncertainties about driving down the cost of technologies. Some of it will be which we'll learn soon. How is IRS going to implement these tax credits? Some of it will be a question, as I noted earlier, like, can we actually build all these wind farms and solar facilities in places that can then be connected to the grid? And it'll be whether we can complement the investment in the energy generating infrastructure with investment in, say, transmission, which has to go through these planning processes and siting and review and so on, that will actually enable us to make the most of those subsidies.
You've obviously asked a great question because we all wanted to talk about it. I think consumer behavior is often an underappreciated force in the market, and as investors, we try to pay close attention to that. Our view is that you often have certain normative values that then start to shape policy, it impacts R&D decisions, that impacts capital allocation, and that kind of comes back to consumers then behaving differently. We saw this in the plastic space, and from an investor standpoint, if increasingly consumers do not want to buy a lot of plastic packaged goods, that may not impact the valuations of big consumer packaged goods companies like a Pepsi or a Coca-Cola or a Unilever, but it does put pressure on them to then change their supply chains, which has then inevitably impacted the valuations of plastic packaging companies. And those companies have had to rethink their product mix, which has changed their margins and their valuations. So that's why consumer behavior is quite an important signal. And there's often a perception that consumers over the world do behave differently, but there is a perception that it's mostly European consumers that care about the energy transition and climate change. The New York Center for Sustainable Business has done a study showing, looking at over 77,000 SKUs of consumer goods, and they've seen that the market share of consumer products that market themselves with a sustainability attribute has grown by 5 to 7 times than products that do not market themselves. Of course, consumers continue to be price conscious, and the quality and the functionality of the product matters, but consumers are voting with their wallet, and we're seeing that in the data. So that is an opportunity for us to invest in companies proactively that are doing this the right way.
Hi, I'm Chris Mowry. I chair the Global Fusion Industry Association, also CEO of Type 1 Energy. This is not a fusion-specific question, but Peter, in particular, you and Joe's comments on policy and the gaps between commitments and goals and whether energy policy should drive stronger or more aggressive goals and commitments that companies should go execute. I worry more about whether we have the right tools. Joe, you talked about, and Peter, the price of solar coming down. I mean, that's an existing tool that's getting better. But you look around the world, and there's tons of examples where these existing tools and existing policies and commitments are driving either wrong behavior or moving us backwards. Countries in Europe where, they're building more coal even though they've built tons of solar and wind. States in the U.S. where they're asking people to not recharge their electric vehicles and things like this in order, because the electricity generating system, due to pursuit of existing policies with the existing portfolio of tools, isn't getting us there. And so I'm just wondering from your perspective, what it is that we should do, because there's going to be some announcements coming out tomorrow that'll give some additional opportunities to engage with government, how we shape policy not just around commitments and goals, but the development of real-world tools that can actually allow us to achieve these goals and commitments. Because from a private sector perspective, I can say a lot of the reason why these goals aren't actually being met is because in the real world, we don't actually have the tools to go do it. And it's fine to say, to push companies and countries to achieve the goals, but if there is not a real world ability to actually do that because we don't have the tools, shouldn't there be more focus, or maybe not? I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on whether there should be more, let's say, pull policy than push policy, and policies that motivate and stimulate innovation on a new set of tools that can realistically allow private sector to actually achieve these goals.
Well, I think this may have to be the final question, so it's a good final question. Look, I think the way I would put it is coming back to the evolution of technology, because I'm not entirely sure what you meant by tools, but the way I would think about it is we are clearly in many sectors not from a technology perspective where we need to be to hit the net zero objectives, especially in the harder to solve sectors like steel, like container shipping, like air transportation, et cetera. The good news is there's lots of ideas out there. Some of them are a little zanier than others, and that's healthy at this stage. And so the question becomes, what can you do to continue to encourage further movement in technology, further innovation? The Inflation Reduction Act actually includes a slew of measures intended to continue to spark innovation. And the final thing I'd say is it comes back a little bit to the other measures that governments can do. So I mentioned the Green Aluminum and Steel Club as an example. I think one of the motivations for that, it's effectively imposing an implicit price on emissions in those sectors. And that is, whether it's an implicit price or an explicit price, that is one additional way of trying to encourage innovation. So I agree with you that we're not technically where we need to be yet. Depends sector by sector, obviously, and I think that may be my interpretation of what you meant by tools. And the question becomes how we can encourage further innovation. And I think it's there are a lot of things that were already done, and obviously there's more that needs to be done. But let me turn it over to Joe for final comment.
So I think part of the challenge is we've got, from a policy standpoint, we're still using a 20th century toolkit for a 21st century problem. When we look at the energy economy today, we're seeing what were traditionally very high walls between sectors. We would never think about petroleum competing with electricity or with the energy we use to produce electricity for mobility. Now we do. We wouldn't really think about, like where I live in Massachusetts, electricity meaningfully competing with natural gas or heating oil for heating. Now we do. The challenge is we still have a lot of our policy frameworks are very much technology focused, traditionally sector focused. They're not really making the most of what I think is the opportunity about the kind of innovation we're already seeing. And they're not really then setting the foundation for the next round of innovation that we know that we need. So this is why I think there's a potential for incredible value here, whether it is in the context of the Paris Agreement with transparency and review, not just like, it's not that interesting to say we know we're not doing enough to cut our emissions. It's like, what do we do next? What have we learned? In the context of Article 13 transparency on individual countries, knowing whether or not a country's meeting its NDC is not that interesting. It's understanding what have they done, what have they learned, what could they do better, what are some good ideas they can actually share with someone else. I think about this in the context of how we're implementing the IRA, where there may be opportunities to implement evaluation to really figure out what policies work well and which ones don't. Some are going to surprise on the upside, some are going to surprise on the downside. So I think part of that is I think there is this opportunity for learning. We can come up then, I think, with new policy ideas and new tools. The other challenge, though, is, as my dean often says, when he comes to me and says, well, like, what are we going to do about climate change? And I talk about this policy instrument and that policy instrument. And he's like, no, Joe, what are we going to do about the politics? The politics is a challenge, a fundamental challenge, certainly in the U.S., but it's not just a unique problem in the U.S. when we think about the politics. How we think about the evolution of the politics that can actually, I think, potentially open up new ideas or opportunities for new ideas in the policy space may help us develop some of these tools we're going to need so that companies really can be more aggressive in how they decarbonize. But we're going to need to see change, I think, on both policy and politics if we're going to be effective with the kind of decarbonization we need.
And we're just about out of time, but many thanks for attending Lazard's inaugural COP session. We'll be serving lunch downstairs in the pavilion.